The moment the world stopped, the studio lights dimmed as the host gave the countdown. Behind the cameras, crew members moved quietly, adjusting their headsets and whispering into microphones. The show was going live in less than 60 seconds, and the anticipation was electric. Tonight's guest wasn't just another celebrity, he was Keanu Reeves, the quiet man who had become a symbol of humility, grace, and kindness in a world obsessed with noise and attention. But tonight something was different. Keanu wasn't here to promote a movie or talk about Hollywood. He had requested this interview personally. No handlers, no scripts. Just him, live, and a message he said the world needed to hear. As the cameras rolled, the host, a well-known media personality named Elliot Brooks, welcomed the audience. He smiled, but there was a nervous twitch in his eye. Even he could sense this wasn't going to be a normal night. He turned to Keanu, who sat calmly in a black shirt and jeans, eyes steady, hands folded. "Keanu," Elliot said, "you've been in the public eye for decades, but never have you asked to go live on your own terms. May I ask, why tonight?" Keanu looked down for a moment, took a deep breath, and then met the camera's gaze. The silence in the room became heavy. Millions were watching. Millions were waiting. "Because some truths," he said gently, "can't wait anymore." Elliot shifted slightly in his chair. "And you're talking about Pope Francis," Keanu replied. "And something he told me that changed the way I see life, faith, and humanity." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Even Elliot leaned back, momentarily stunned. Keanu's voice didn't waver. He began to tell the story. How years ago, before the world ever knew about it, he had visited Vatican City not for a tour or press coverage, but for a private meeting. One arranged without fanfare, without headlines. Keanu had questions, deep, painful ones that had followed him for years. Not about religion necessarily, but about why the world seemed so full of loss and silence when people needed hope the most. "I had just come from visiting a children's hospital," Keanu said. "One of the kids, and she asked me why God let her be born just to suffer. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't sleep that night." He paused, visibly emotional. "I knew Pope Francis was different," he continued. "He was the only one who didn't seem to hide behind titles. So I asked for a meeting, and I never told anyone, until now." Elliot swallowed hard. Even the crew had stopped moving. This was not a planned segment. This wasn't entertainment. This was raw truth. "Pope Francis met with me in the gardens of the Vatican," Keanu said. "No press, no robes. He sat on a bench like a tired grandfather. He listened, not like a pope, like a man who carried the weight of the whole world on his shoulders." Keanu's eyes began to well up and his voice softened. "I told him everything. About the pain of losing my loved ones. About the loneliness that follows success. About the kids in hospitals. About the world that celebrates greed and forgets kindness. I asked him, 'Where is God in all this?' And he looked at me, not with an answer, but with tears." There was complete silence in the studio now. He said, "Keanu, maybe God is in your question. Maybe he's in the tears. Maybe God doesn't always stop the pain, but he never leaves us alone in it." Keanu looked into the camera again. That answer didn't fix everything, but it reminded me that pain is not the absence of God. It's often where he hides. Elliot was speechless. For the first time in his career, he forgot he was on live TV. But Keanu wasn't done. "I've kept that moment private for years, but the world has become too divided, too cruel. We need to remember that compassion is divine. And Pope Francis, he taught me that our questions, our doubts, can lead us closer to truth than blind belief ever could." As the live feed continued, comments flooded the internet. Some people cried. Some called it a hoax. Others fell silent, touched by a truth they didn't expect from a Hollywood icon. But there was more Keanu had yet to say. Truths still hidden beneath the surface. Truths that would shake the public, stir faiths, and spark global conversations. And none of them knew. Part 2 would change everything. The letter that should have never existed. The studio went silent for a long moment after Keanu finished speaking. Elliot Brooks stared at him, stunned, forgetting even to cut to commercial. A producer in the back waved frantically, signaling to go to a break, but Keanu held up a hand, calm and firm. "Please," he said softly. "Let me finish this." Elliot nodded slowly. His usual sharp wit and questions dissolved into quiet. "Sorry?" Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded a small, creased piece of old parchment. It looked fragile, like it had survived fire and time. There were faded markings on it, strange symbols along the edges, but the words at the center were clear, typed, signed, and sealed. Keanu held it up with both hands, showing it to the camera, without saying a word. The audience watching from homes, cafes, and hospital rooms leaned closer to their screens. They had no idea that what he was about to read would ripple across the world. "This letter," Keanu began, "was given to me by Pope Francis. He told me he wasn't supposed to show it to anyone, that even within the church this was dangerous. But he believed truth is more sacred than control." Elliot shifted forward in his seat, eyes glued to the parchment. Keanu looked down and began to read. "To the future bearer of the light. If this message has reached you, then the silence has grown too loud. Humanity has wandered too far into division. This world was never meant to be ruled by fear or doctrine. It was meant to be guided by love. The path we protect in secrecy must now be known. The world must be reminded that God is not a place. He is not a name. He is a breath, a choice, an act of compassion when no one's watching. If you read this, do not seek to convince. Only seek to become." Keanu stopped and looked up. His voice cracked slightly. This was written by a pope over 100 years ago, one who vanished mysteriously, with no explanation. Pope Francis found this in the Vatican archives. He said it was sealed beneath a false wall, wrapped in cloth with a golden symbol, a human hand, open wide. Elliot couldn't hide his confusion now. But why? Why would the church hide something like that? Keanu folded the letter and placed it on the table. "Because it challenges control," he said. "Because it reminds people that God isn't owned by religion. He's present in kindness and forgiveness, in the silence after we've been hurt and still choose not to hate." There was a pause. Elliot finally spoke again, slowly, carefully. "Are you saying the church knew all this, time that faith wasn't meant to be institutionalized?" Keanu looked him in the eyes. "I'm saying the truest leaders know it, but not everyone wants the truth to be free." He leaned back in his seat and told a story that hadn't been shared outside the walls of the Vatican. The story of a woman named Sister Helena, a nun who had devoted her life to the poor in the slums of South America. Decades ago, she wrote essays questioning the rigid practices of power in religious institutions. She spoke about a God that existed outside cathedrals, found in dirty hands of the poor, in dying breaths of the sick, and in whispered apologies between enemies. Her writings, though never published, were seen as dangerous. Pope Francis, then a young cardinal, found one of her pages tucked inside a soup kitchen Bible. It read, "If God is everywhere, why do we keep locking him behind doors only priests can open?" He never forgot her words. Keanu explained how the Pope told him that Sister Helena's work was part of the same mystery as the letter he now held. Both hinted at a faith that could not be manipulated, one that empowered every human being to become a living sermon of love. The actor's voice softened again. He said, "Keanu, the world doesn't need more believers. It needs more good neighbors, more strangers becoming friends, more people who show up when no one's watching." That sentence lingered in the air like sacred smoke. Elliot tried to gather his thoughts, but Keanu wasn't done. "Pope Francis wanted me to share this not because I'm famous," he said, "but because I'm no one special. I've failed. I've been broken. I've stood at the edge of life, wondering if there's anything left. And yet, here I am, not because I deserve answers, but because I dared to ask questions." At that moment, viewers across the globe began recording, tweeting, and live sharing the segment. Some were moved, others confused, a few angry, but all were captivated. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't gossip. It was something more raw, an invitation to wake up. Just then, a producer handed Elliot a message on a small card. Elliot read it, his eyes growing wide. "We're being contacted by the Vatican press office," he said aloud, stunned. "They want to respond. Tonight." Keanu gave a tired smile. "Then let them. Truth doesn't fear a response." Outside, the studio, a group of people had started gathering, holding candles. No signs, no chants, just silent vigil. Something sacred was happening and they didn't want to miss it. Inside, Keanu looked into the camera one last time before the break. "The truth is not mine to own," he said. "It belongs to anyone who chooses kindness when they're hurt, mercy when they're strong, and love when it's hard." Then he whispered almost to himself, "And Pope Francis. He showed me what that really means." The screen faded to black, and the world held its breath for what would come next. The phone call from the Vatican. The cameras returned from break, but the air in the studio had changed. It was heavier now, electric with silence. Even the background music that usually played during transitions was cut. Viewers watching from around the world weren't just glued to their screens. They were leaning forward, phones forgotten, dinner plates untouched. Something sacred was unfolding on live television, and every second felt like a heartbeat echoing through humanity itself. Elliot Brooks sat with the card still trembling in his hand. Moments ago, his producer had passed it to him, his face pale and disbelieving. Across from him, Keanu sat calmly, like a man who had already made peace with the storm he'd just released. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. Elliot cleared his throat and turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just received confirmation that a senior representative from the Vatican press office will be joining us live via video call within the next few minutes." He paused. "They've requested to speak directly with Mr. Reeves." The words struck like lightning. Keanu gave a slow nod. "Let them." Outside the studio, the candlelight vigil had grown. People gathered silently under the darkening sky, drawn by something they couldn't explain. No slogans, no protests, just the quiet fire of truth pulling them together. Cars passed slowly, passengers watching from their windows. Something told them this night would not be forgotten. Inside, the screen behind Keanu and Elliot flickered, and a face appeared. He was an older man, dressed in simple black, with sharp yet kind eyes behind square glasses. He introduced himself as Monsignor Luca Benedetti, spokesperson for the Vatican press office. "Good evening, Mr. Reeves," he said, his Italian accent gentle but firm. "We have been watching your broadcast." Keanu gave a respectful nod. "Then you already know everything I've said." "Yes," Luca replied. "And what you have shared is both true and incomplete." Elliot straightened in his chair. "Incomplete?" Luca nodded. "Pope Francis has known for years about the letter you mentioned. But what you do not know, and what he did not tell you, perhaps to protect you, is that there was a second part, a companion document, written in the same hand, but sealed under a different name." Keanu's calm demeanor flickered for a moment. He leaned forward. "Where is it?" Luca looked directly at the camera. "It's in my possession, and by the authority of His Holiness I have been instructed to read it aloud." "Now." Elliot's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. This wasn't journalism anymore. It was history being written in real time. Luca unfolded a second parchment, held together by a crimson ribbon. He took a deep breath and began to read. "To the bearer of the living flame. If you read this, then the first fire has already been lit. You must know, faith was never meant to divide. Its purpose is not certainty but courage, not conquest but compassion. There will be those who mock you, who brand you a heretic, a fool, or worse. But do not look away, for in your doubt, God breathes. In your love, God lives. And in your kindness, God reigns." Luca looked up. This document was signed by Pope Celestine Vires in the year 1294, months before he resigned. Historians believed he left because of political pressure, but perhaps It was because he saw a truth the world wasn't ready for. Elliot blinked, stunned. You're saying this truth spans centuries? Yes, Luca said. And now, Mr. Reeves has brought it into the light. There was a pause. Then, Keanu leaned forward again. Monsignor, he said gently, why tell the world now? Luca's expression softened. Because truth kept in shadows becomes poison. Pope Francis believes we have reached a tipping point in the world, where the loudest voices are often the least loving, where faith is weaponized and silence is bought with power. But Mr. Reeves, your story, your humility, your pain, it carries a weight people recognize. You didn't speak to convert, you spoke to connect, and that is the miracle. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment. Perhaps for the first time that evening, he looked truly overwhelmed. He told me to wait, Keanu whispered, until the world was listening. Luca nodded slowly. And now, the world is. Elliot finally broke in. Monsignor, may I ask what happens next? Luca gave a small smile. What always happens when people wake up? Some will fight the light, others will run toward it, but the world will never be the same. The call ended. Keanu sat back, hands clasped, eyes wet but unwavering. I didn't come tonight to shake faith, he said. I came to remind people that real faith is what you do when no one's clapping. It's how you treat people you don't agree with. It's whether you let your pain harden you or teach you compassion. He looked at Elliot and Pope Francis. He risked everything to protect that message, not for himself, but for you, for me, for the lonely, the lost, the forgotten, the broken. Elliot finally asked, Is there more you haven't told us? Keanu hesitated, then said slowly, Yes, one more truth, one more moment, one that changed me forever. The audience leaned forward. Even the stars outside seemed to freeze. But that, Keanu said softly, belongs to part 4. The boy in the chapel. The studio lights seemed dimmer now, as if they too had grown reverent under the weight of what had just happened. People around the world were not simply watching anymore, they were feeling. Grown men sat in silence, children listened without blinking, and elderly women clutched rosaries without even realizing it. Something ancient, beautiful, and raw had been unearthed. Not a scandal, not a rebellion, but a remembering. Keanu Reeves remained seated in his chair, but his body had shifted forward, his hands lightly folded between his knees. His voice had grown quieter, softer, not out of fear, but because the story he was about to tell didn't belong to loudness. It belonged to a whisper, to the kind of truth that can only be heard when the heart is still. I met a boy, Keanu said, in a forgotten chapel just outside Rome. Elliot Brooks furrowed his brow. When was this? After my meeting with Pope Francis, Keanu replied. I had just stepped outside the Vatican gardens, still trying to understand everything, he told me. My soul felt like a wound that had been opened and cleaned. It didn't hurt, but it felt exposed, vulnerable. He smiled faintly, almost sadly. I needed to walk, he continued, so I told my driver to wait. I wandered for hours through alleys and side streets until I came across this tiny, broken-down chapel. The doors were half closed and the roof was falling in, but something drew me in. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was forgotten. He paused, collecting his breath. And there, in the center aisle, was a boy, maybe 9 or 10, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, alone, barefoot. Elliot blinked. A child? Alone? Keanu nodded. Yes. He looked up at me, and I swear to you, it was like staring into a mirror, not of my face, but of something deeper. His eyes didn't flinch, they didn't even seem surprised. He just asked me, Why are you still searching? Elliot whispered. What did you say? I asked him who he was. And Keanu looked down, the memory still etched deep in his heart. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny folded cloth. It was stained, old, embroidered with one single word, agape. Elliot leaned forward. Greek? Keanu nodded. It means divine love, unconditional love, the kind that doesn't depend on being good or perfect or worthy. It just is. The room was still. Even the control booth had stopped giving cues. Asked him where he got it, Keanu said, and he said from someone who remembered. He paused again, and for a moment his voice trembled. I asked if he was waiting for someone. He said, no, I'm reminding them. Elliot stared at him, stunned. Reminding who? Us, Keanu said. Everyone. The boy told me the chapel had once been a place where travelers came to cry, not to confess, not to be fixed, just to be held in the silence. Elliot opened his mouth but found no words. I sat with him, Keanu continued, for a long time. I don't know how long. He didn't speak again. He just held the cloth in his palm and stared at the light coming through the shattered glass. And when I finally stood to leave, he wasn't there. What do you mean? Elliot whispered. He disappeared. I searched every corner, outside, inside, nothing, not even footprints. But the cloth was left in my seat. Keanu reached into his pocket and slowly pulled it out. He unfolded the same cloth, aged, stained, and fragile. The camera zoomed in gently. Stitched in careful threads was one word, just as he said, agape. Elliot covered his mouth with his hand. Are you saying he was an angel? Keanu shook his head slowly. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe he was something even more rare, someone who had remembered the truth that the world forgot. He looked into the camera. We chase religion. We chase answers. We chase identity. But sometimes the thing we need most is not a conclusion, it's a connection. Sometimes we don't need someone to preach at us. We need someone to sit next to us in a ruined place and simply say, I'm here too. He gently folded the cloth again. And that's what Pope Francis tried to tell me. That faith doesn't come from being certain. It comes from choosing love, even when you're scared, even when you don't understand. Elliot finally found his voice. So what did you do after that? Keanu smiled faintly. I went back to the Vatican. I found Pope Francis in his study alone. He looked up at me and smiled as if he already knew, and I asked him, how do we change the world? Elliot asked quietly. What did he say? Keanu's eyes glistened as he recalled the words. He said, you don't, you love it, and love will do the rest. Outside, the vigil had grown into thousands. People stood arm in arm, silent, some crying, others praying, and none of them knew why they had come. Only that something holy was happening and they didn't want to miss it. In homes around the world, people hugged their children tighter. They picked up their phones to apologize to old friends. They knelt by their beds not to beg, but just to say thank you. For breath, for love, for one more chance. And in the studio, Keanu whispered one final line. The boy in the chapel reminded me, God is not thunder. He is not power. He is not a crown. He is the whisper that tells you, you are not alone. And just as he finished, a breaking news alert flashed across the screen. The Vatican was issuing a global invitation, an open letter signed by Pope Francis himself titled, The Forgotten Face of God. It was going to be read aloud for the first time in Part 5. The Forgotten Face of God, the broadcast had already broken every expectation, every rule of television. Yet no one left their seats. Not the audience in the studio, not the crew behind the cameras, and certainly not the millions watching from every time zone around the world. People who had planned to watch only a few minutes were now sitting on their floors, hearts in their throats, eyes fixed on a truth too deep for entertainment, too real for headlines. Elliot Brooks looked at his producer behind the glass, who nodded silently with eyes wide and fingers trembling. We just received the full document, Elliot said into the camera. an open letter written personally by Pope Francis titled The Forgotten Face of God, and he has requested that Mr. Reeves read it himself. Keanu, who had remained composed through even the most soul-shaking revelations, now took a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. He accepted the letter with both hands. It was printed plainly on a single sheet of parchment. No gold seals, no papal crests, just black ink on faded white. Simplicity that spoke louder than any ornament ever. He began to read. To the ones who wonder, to the doubters, the tired, the angry, and the seekers, this is for you. Not from a pope, not from a throne, but from a brother among you. A man who has walked long enough to realize that the face of God is not hidden. It is simply ignored. The words hit with the weight of Scripture, yet carried the intimacy of a whisper from a loved one. I have spent years in marble halls, Keanu read, speaking with leaders, writing encyclicals, blessing the faithful, but never have I felt God more present than in the eyes of a woman who forgave the man who harmed her son. Never have I heard God's voice more clearly than in the silence between two enemies choosing not to raise their fists. A hush fell across the world. The internet, often so loud, began to quiet. Comment sections slowed. Phones stopped buzzing. It was as if the entire planet paused to listen. You ask me where God is? Keanu continued. He is not in the golden cups or ancient books alone. He is in the man who feeds a stranger without asking why. He is in the nurse who holds a dying hand after a 12-hour shift. He is in the addict who tries again, even when he's failed 10 times before. Keanu's hands trembled now. Not out of weakness, but because the words struck something sacred inside him. Something too fragile to explain. He pressed on. We have dressed God in robes, crowned him with jewels, painted him in unreachable glory. And in doing so, we have forgotten his true face. The child weeping in the dark. The prisoner whispering a prayer. The mother burying her baby. That is where he lives. Not to test us, not to punish, but to sit beside us in the dust. Elliot wiped away a tear. He wasn't alone. The camera caught a young intern in the corner of the studio, her face soaked, hands clutched, over her mouth. Keanu cleared his throat gently and kept reading. If you want to see God, the letter read, do not look up. Look around. He is in the apology you're afraid to give. He is in the forgiveness you don't think they deserve. He is in the love you withhold because of fear. Give those things freely, and you will no longer ask where God is. You will feel him inside you. A soft sob escaped from the audience, but no one turned to look. The emotion was shared, not judged. And to those who have been told they are unworthy, unholy, unwanted, let this letter be your rebellion. You are God's favorite place to dwell, not in palaces, but in the heart that keeps beating even after it's been broken, in the voice that chooses kindness when cruelty would be easier, in the arms that open again and again after being let down. Keanu stopped reading. His eyes were too full. His breath caught. Elliot gently reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. Do you want me to finish it? Keanu shook his head. No, I must. He asked me to. He blinked away the tears and read the last few lines, his voice cracking but steady. We are not here to be perfect. We are here to be present, to be real, to fall, to rise, to weep, to love. If you do these things with an honest heart, then God has never left you. He lowered the letter, folded it with reverent hands, and set it gently on the table. The world felt changed in that moment, not by scandal, not by fear, but by the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Elliot finally spoke. This changes everything. Keanu nodded slowly. No, this reminds everything. The audience stood without being asked. No applause, just stillness, reverence, tears, hope. Outside, people began embracing one another. Strangers shared candles. Children asked questions. Old men remembered prayers they thought they'd forgotten. And far away, in the heart of Vatican City, Pope Francis sat alone in a small room. The TV was on. He watched Keanu finish reading his words. He smiled and whispered softly in Spanish. He did it with love. And then came the final twist. As Elliot leaned in to thank Keanu, another producer rushed into the studio, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. He handed Elliot a note. Elliot read it once, then again. His voice shook as he looked into the camera. "We've just received confirmation," he said. "Pope Francis has vanished from the Vatican." Gasps filled the studio. Keanu looked up slowly, not in fear, but in quiet understanding, because he knew Part 6 would explain everything. The final message, for several long minutes, the studio was frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. The words, "Pope Francis has vanished from the Vatican," echoed through the air like a ghostly bell, shaking everyone to the core. Elliot Brooks stared at the slip of paper in his trembling hand. His throat went dry. His instincts as a journalist told him to start asking questions, pushing for facts, but his heart told him something else entirely. This moment was bigger than headlines. Something deeper was happening, something that couldn't be explained with logic or news alerts. Keanu Reeves sat still, his expression unreadable. His eyes weren't wide with fear. They weren't darting around for answers. Instead, they were focused, like he was listening to something only he could hear. A whisper. A memory. A calling. Where was he last seen? Elliot finally asked. The producer, who looked as if he'd seen a vision. He was in the prayer chapel, the man replied softly. His security team stepped outside to give him privacy for 5 minutes. When they returned, he was gone. No signs of struggle, no notes, no video, just gone. Keanu stood up slowly. "He's not missing," he said, almost in a whisper. "He's doing what he told me to do. He's becoming the message." Elliot looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "Pope Francis didn't want to lead from a throne anymore," Keanu said. "He wanted to lead from the dust, from the dirt, from the shadows where love is needed most. And he knew the only way the world would truly listen is if he disappeared from power and reappeared in presence." Outside, the candlelight vigil had become a sea of lights. Reports were coming in from every part of the globe. People standing in silence together. Cities paused. Trains stopped. Police officers turned off their sirens. Even criminals laid down their weapons in confused, quiet awe. Something unspeakable had been set in motion. And then the phone rang. A studio assistant, stunned and shaking, picked it up and handed it to Elliot. "It's for him," she said. "For Keanu. From Rome." Keanu took the phone and brought it to his ear. "Hello?" he said gently. A woman's voice answered. Soft, steady, familiar. "He asked me to call you," she said. "My name is Sister Maria. I've been his private nurse for 2 years. Before he vanished, he gave me a package. He said, when Keanu reads the letter, call him and give him this." "What is it?" Keanu asked. "A location and a final message." She paused. "Are you ready?" Keanu took a breath. "Yes." She read out the coordinates. A remote village outside Assisi, where a crumbling monastery sat untouched for nearly a century. And then she said, "His final message is not written. He said only you would know what to say because it was never about him. It was always about the light inside every person watching." Keanu closed his eyes. Something swelled inside him. Not pride, not pressure, but a deep knowing, like a lantern being lit in a vast cave. He turned back to the audience, to the world, and he spoke. "This is not about a pope. This is not about a movie star. This is not even about religion. This is about you. You who think your kindness doesn't matter. You who think your tears are weakness. You who feel invisible, unwanted, broken. I need you to hear me. You are the message. You are the living proof that God has not abandoned this world. Your smile, your forgiveness, your gentle strength. They are the miracles we've been waiting for. He stepped forward, not as a celebrity, not as a guest, but as a human. The face of God is not on a coin. It's not in a statue. It's in the moment you choose love when hate would feel easier. It's in the moment you show up for someone who can't pay you back. It's in the moment you sit with someone who's suffering and say, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. A child in the audience began to cry softly. A man near the back dropped to his knees. People held hands. Strangers leaned on one another. Keanu placed a hand over his heart. He's out there now, he said. Not gone. Not hiding. Just where he's always been, in the places no one wants to look. Then he turned to Elliot. I have to go. Elliot didn't stop him. He just nodded. Keanu walked out of the studio. No security, no flashing lights, no crowd, just quiet footsteps echoing into the night. In the weeks that followed, sightings of Pope Francis began to emerge, not in cathedrals but in unexpected places. A homeless shelter in Lisbon where a stranger washed the feet of addicts. A hospital in Kenya where an old man helped change wound dressings in silence. A slum school in Mumbai where someone taught children math with joy in his eyes and scars on his hands. No confirmation. No photos. Only whispers. But they didn't need proof anymore, because something had changed. People started showing up. In neighborhoods. In broken families. In dying communities. Not to preach. Not to dominate. Just to love. Because they had been reminded. A quiet actor, by a brave pope, and by a whisper in a forgotten chapel, that God was never missing, only waiting to be seen in us.